Hello, Internet, and welcome to 8-Bit History, the show where we treat history like a series of 8-bit platformers, simple to jump into, but tricky to master. And we're here to try and beat the final boss of understanding. Today, we're talking about what might be the most overlooked, least power-up giving, yet most pivotal event in human history: the agricultural revolution. Yeah, that whole humanity's great leap forward thing. But what if I told you that leap was actually our trip and fall moment? Now think about our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We imagine them as primitive, constantly starving, and running from saber-tooths, right? Well, anthropologists have a slightly different take. In fact, they might have been the original affluent society. Think about it. Varied diet, plenty of exercise, small social bands, no bosses, no taxes. It's said they could meet their needs working just 15 to 20 hours a week. The rest of the time, chilling, socializing, making art. Basically, life was a bit of a victory lap. But then, around 12,000 years ago, something happened. Humanity went into, "This game is too easy. Let's crank up the difficulty" mode and downloaded the agriculture update. People started planting seeds, domesticating animals. On the surface, it sounds like a fantastic idea. We can control our food supply. We can stockpile. No more pesky migrating. However, this new gameplay mechanic came with a bunch of bugs and debuffs. Working hours. Those chill 20 hours were replaced by 50 to 60 hours of backbreaking labor in the fields. People started working more. Nutrition. Instead of a variety of fruits, meats, and nuts, our diets became reliant on a few staple grains like wheat and barley. This meant lower nutrition and, evidence shows, actually shorter statures. Health. Living in crowded permanent settlements right next to our animals introduced new zombie hordes: smallpox, cholera, plague. Our bone density even went down. Social stratification. Food stockpiles led to the rise of a class who could say, "This is mine." Slavery, large-scale warfare, and social inequality became new and unpleasant features of the game. So, the ultimate question is, was the agricultural revolution humanity's greatest power-up, or its most catastrophic skill issue? Was it the start of the path that led to civilization, science, and the device you're watching this on? Or was it a trap that made us work harder, eat worse, and get sick more often? The answer is probably somewhere in between. But in our next episode, we'll see how this revolution set off a domino effect that led to writing, the wheel, kings, and empires. So, what do you guys think? Was farming a good move? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next 8-bit history adventure. To understand the magnitude of our mistake, we must first shatter the mirror of our own vanity. Modern humans view history as a linear march of progress, a climb from the dark, savage caves of our ancestors toward the bright lights of civilization. We imagine the hunter-gatherer life as nasty, brutish, and short. We picture them freezing, starving, and constantly running from predators. But when we strip away our modern bias and look at the anthropological evidence, a shocking reality emerges. For the vast majority of our existence, human beings lived in what many experts now call the original affluent society. Let's begin with the most basic human need: food. Today, the average human relies on a handful of staple crops: wheat, rice, corn, and potatoes. If one of these fails, millions starve. But the hunter-gatherer knew no such anxiety. Their menu was the entire ecosystem. They consumed hundreds of different species of plants, roots, nuts, insects, and game. This wasn't just survival. It was a nutritional buffet that provided a perfect balance of vitamins, minerals, and protein. The evidence of this golden age is written in our bones. When archaeologists examine skeletons from 30,000 years ago, they find humans who were tall, robust, and physically imposing. Their teeth were healthy, free from the cavities that sugar-rich grain diets would later bring. They showed few signs of the malnutrition or chronic disease that would ravage later peasant societies. They were the Olympic athletes of history, shaped by a life of constant, varied movement, not the repetitive, back-breaking grind of the plow. But perhaps the most enviable aspect of their lives was time. In our modern world, we pride ourselves on efficiency, yet we work 40, 50, sometimes 60 hours a week just to survive. We are slaves to the clock. Contrast this with the Kalahari Bushmen or the Hadza people. Studies suggest that ancient foragers only needed to work about 3 to 5 hours a day to secure enough calories and shelter for their entire group. 3, 2, 5 hours. What did they do with the rest of their time? They didn't spend it anxiously checking stock markets or worrying about next year's harvest. They spent it socializing. They told stories around the fire. They played with their children. They created art, and they slept. They lived in the present moment, deeply connected to their community and their environment. They had no concept of poverty because they had no concept of hoarding wealth. In a world where you carry everything you own on your back, status isn't defined by what you have, but by who you are. They were not prisoners of nature. They were its masters. They navigated the world with a mental map more complex than any GPS, knowing the secrets of every plant and animal. So we must ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. If our ancestors were taller, healthier, freer, and had more leisure time than the average office worker or factory laborer of today, why did we give it all up? Why did we trade this paradise for the shackles of the farm? If the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was a biological jackpot, the transition to agriculture was something closer to a bankruptcy. When we look at the physical remains of early farmers, we don't see a species that has leveled up. Instead, we see a species in rapid physical decline. The first and most visible evidence of this mistake is simply our size. For tens of thousands of years, humans were tall and robust. But as soon as we settled down to farm, we shrank. Skeletal remains found in Greece and Turkey reveal a startling truth. Following the adoption of agriculture, the average height of men crashed by nearly 15 centimeters, about 6 inches, and women shrank even more. It would take humanity thousands of years, all the way until the modern era, to regain the stature we lost when we abandoned the wild. Why did this happen? The answer lies in the trap of monoculture. A hunter-gatherer's diet was a complex mix of proteins, fats, and fibers derived from dozens of sources. But the farmer traded this diversity for a diet overwhelmingly dominated by a single starchy crop, usually wheat, rice, or corn. While these grains provided cheap calories to fuel a growing population, they were nutritionally hollow. Early farmers were essentially stuffing themselves with carbohydrates while starving of essential vitamins and minerals. The bones of these early agriculturalists tell a grim tale of suffering. Paleopathologists, scientists who study ancient diseases, have found clear signs of iron deficiency anemia, indicated by porosity in the skull. Their teeth, once healthy and strong, became riddled with cavities and abscesses, rotting away due to the high sugar content of their grain-heavy diets. Their spines and joints show the wear and tear of repetitive back-breaking labor, grinding grain for hours on end and tilling the earth, tasks our bodies were never evolved to do. But malnutrition was only half the curse. The other half was risk. By relying on a single crop, farmers put all their eggs in one basket. A hunter-gatherer tribe could survive a bad season. If the gazelles didn't migrate, they ate berries. If the berries failed, they dug for roots. They were diversified. But for the farmer, diversity was gone. If the rains came too late, or a swarm of locusts arrived, or a fungus attacked the wheat, there was no backup plan. This introduced a terrifying new concept to the human experience: mass famine. Paradoxically, in our quest to control nature and secure more food, we made ourselves infinitely more vulnerable to starvation. We built granaries to store our wealth, but in doing so, we built a trap that would snap shut on millions of people for millennia to come. We had traded the robust, resilient body of the forager for a smaller, weaker, and more fragile vessel. If malnutrition and physical degeneration were the slow killers of the agricultural revolution, the fast killers were waiting just around the corner. When humans decided to settle down, build permanent villages, and domesticate animals, we unwittingly unlocked Pandora's box. For the first time in history, we created the perfect breeding ground for the deadliest enemy our species has ever faced: the epidemic. To understand why, we must look at how hunter-gatherers lived. They were nomadic. They moved constantly. If a tribe generated waste or refuse, they simply walked away from it. They left their parasites and bacteria behind. Furthermore, they lived in small bands. If a deadly virus did emerge, it might kill that small group, but it had nowhere else to go. It burned out. But the farmer changed the rules of the game. Farmers lived in permanent settlements, often surrounded by their own accumulated waste and sewage. They lived in dense clusters, breathing the same air, drinking from the same contaminated water sources. But the true catalyst for disaster was our new roommates, the animals. We didn't just herd cows, pigs, chickens, and goats. We lived with them. We slept under the same roofs, walked through their manure, and drank their milk. This unnatural intimacy allowed viruses and bacteria to jump the species barrier, a process known as zoonosis. Almost every major infectious disease that has plagued humanity over the last 10,000 years came from our farm animals. We got measles and tuberculosis from cattle. We got influenza from pigs and ducks. We got smallpox from camels or rodents attracted to our grain stores. The common cold likely jumped to us from horses. Before agriculture, these diseases simply did not exist in human populations. We engineered them. These early villages and cities became biological death traps. For thousands of years, the mortality rate in early cities was so high that they were essentially population sinks. More people died in them than were born. They could only sustain themselves by constantly drawing in new waves of healthy peasants from the countryside, who would then get sick and die in turn. So the agricultural revolution didn't just give us bread. It gave us the Black Death, the Spanish flu, and every major pandemic in history. We had traded the open air of the savannah for the suffocating, feverish embrace of the crowded city, and our immune systems have been paying the price ever since. We have talked about shrinking bones and deadly viruses, but perhaps the greatest tragedy of the agricultural revolution was not biological, but social. It was the death of freedom and the birth of oppression. To understand this, we have to look at the economic reality of our ancestors. For nearly all of human history, equality was not just a moral ideal, it was a survival necessity. Hunter-gatherers were nomads. They moved constantly. This meant you could not accumulate wealth. You could not own more than you could carry on your back. If you tried to hoard food, it would rot. If you tried to hoard weapons or tools, they would weigh you down. As a result, there were no billionaires and no beggars in the Stone Age. Everyone had roughly the same amount of stuff, which was almost nothing. This enforced a strict, radical equality. Decisions were made by the group, and leaders were temporary, based on skill, not bloodline. But agriculture changed the fundamental math of human existence. For the first time, humans could produce a surplus. A farmer could grow more grain than he needed to eat today. And critically, grains like wheat and rice could be stored for years without spoiling. This seemingly positive development, the ability to store food, was the root of all future tyranny. Suddenly, food became capital. It became wealth. And the moment you have a stockpile of wealth sitting in a granary, you have something to steal. This introduced a new dynamic, the need for protection. Farmers needed walls, and they needed guards to watch the surplus. Enter the protection racket. Strongmen, warriors, and charismatic priests emerged, offering to protect the farmers' hard-earned grain from raiders. But this protection came at a price. They demanded a portion of the harvest as tax. Over generations, these protectors morphed into oppressors. The village strongman became the chief became the king, and the king eventually claimed to be a god. For the first time in history, society was split into two distinct classes. The tiny minority of elites who did not work but lived in luxury, and the vast majority of peasants who toiled from sunrise to sunset to feed them. The surplus food didn't go to feeding hungry children. It went to building palaces, temples, and armies. Agriculture also gave birth to the most horrific invention in human history: slavery. In a hunter-gatherer society, slavery is almost impossible. You cannot force a slave to hunt for you with a spear. They will simply run away or use the weapon against you. But on a farm, slavery becomes economically viable. You can chain a human being, stand over them with a whip, and force them to perform the repetitive, back-breaking labor of digging ditches, harvesting crops, and grinding grain. The success of early civilizations, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, was built on the backs of unfree labor. This shift fundamentally rewired the human psyche. We moved from a mindset of sharing to a mindset of hoarding. We drew lines in the dirt and invented the concept of property. We invented the words mine and yours, and with property came the incentive for total war. Hunter-gatherers fought skirmishes over territory or personal grudges, but farmers fought wars of conquest. If you could conquer the neighboring valley, you didn't just defeat an enemy. You acquired their land, their granaries, and their labor force. Thus, the agricultural revolution paved the way for patriarchy, feudalism, and the state. The average human lost the autonomy of the wild and became a cog in a machine designed to generate wealth for someone else. We traded the dangers of the wilderness for the cruelty of the hierarchy. When we calculate the costs of the agricultural revolution, the disease, the famine, the tyranny, we often overlook the group that paid the highest price of all: women. To understand the origins of gender inequality, we must understand that patriarchy is not a biological inevitability. It is a historical invention, and it was invented on the farm. In hunter-gatherer societies, the division of labor was surprisingly egalitarian. While men often hunted, women gathered. And crucial to this balance was the fact that gathering provided the majority of the group's calories. Roots, berries, and nuts were reliable. A hunt was a gamble. Because women were the primary providers of daily food, they held significant economic power and social status. Child-rearing was a communal activity, shared by the tribe, leaving women with autonomy and mobility. But agriculture shattered this balance. As humanity transitioned to the plow, the nature of work changed. Plowing fields required upper body strength that favored men, slowly pushing women out of the primary food production role and into the domestic sphere. But the real cage was biological. Farming societies are obsessed with growth. To work the land, you need hands. You need a labor force. This created an immense pressure to produce as many children as possible. In foraging societies, women spaced their births about 4 years apart because they couldn't carry more than one small child while migrating. But in a settled village, there was no limit. Women became trapped in a cycle of constant pregnancy, birth, and nursing. They were transformed from independent providers into biological machines required to fuel the workforce of the farm. This confinement to the home had a dark side effect: the loss of public voice. As men took over the fields and the granaries, the public economy, women were relegated to the invisible, repetitive labor of the home. Archaeology gives us a haunting glimpse into this life. When scientists examine the skeletons of early female farmers in the Near East, they find specific deformities: curled toes, arthritic knees, and damaged vertebrae. These are the telltale signs of spending hours every single day on their knees, rocking back and forth, grinding grain against a stone quern. It was a life of grueling, monotonous physical torture. Finally, agriculture introduced a concept that sealed the fate of women for millennia: inheritance. Once men began to own land and accumulate wealth, they became obsessed with passing it on to their biological heirs. They needed to know, with 100% certainty, that their son was their son. This anxiety birthed the rigid control of female sexuality. To protect their property lines, men built walls around their fields, and to protect their bloodlines, they built laws around women. Virginity became a commodity. Adultery became a capital crime, often only for women. Marriage shifted from a loose partnership to a property transaction between families. In short, the agricultural revolution didn't just domesticate plants and animals, it domesticated women. It stripped them of their economic power, bound them to the home, and redefined them as the property of fathers and husbands. The roots of modern gender inequality dig deep into the soil of the first Neolithic farms. So, we are left with a paradox. We have established that the agricultural revolution made human beings smaller, sicker, more oppressed, and less free. The natural question follows: why didn't we just quit? Why didn't our ancestors look at their dying crops and their aching backs, throw down their hoes, and walk back into the forest to hunt gazelles? The terrifying answer is, they couldn't. Agriculture was a one-way street. It was a trap that snapped shut the moment the population began to grow. Here is the brutal math of the Neolithic. A band of hunter-gatherers needs a massive amount of territory to survive. A single tribe might roam across hundreds of square kilometers to find enough food. But a farmer, by manipulating the land, can extract huge amounts of calories from a very small patch of earth. This efficiency allowed the human population to explode. Within a few generations of farming, villages grew into towns. Mothers could feed more children with wheat porridge, so more children survived to adulthood. But this population boom created a deadly dependency. Once your village has grew from 50 people to 500 people, you cannot go back to hunting and gathering. The wild land simply cannot support that many mouths. To return to the old way of life would mean watching 90% of your children starve to death. The trap was set. Humanity was forced to work harder and harder just to maintain the miserable population levels it had created. But there was another reason the trap held: violence. Agriculture changed the military balance of the world forever. Individually, a hunter-gatherer warrior was likely stronger, healthier, and a better fighter than a malnourished peasant conscript. But the farmers had something the hunters did not: numbers. Farming societies could field armies of thousands. They could afford to lose soldiers in waves. They had stockpiles of food to sustain long campaigns. When expanding agricultural empires clashed with nomadic tribes, the result was almost always the same. The farmers overwhelmed the foragers through the sheer weight of numbers. The hunter-gatherers were either slaughtered, driven into the most inhospitable deserts and jungles, or forced to pick up a plow and join the machine. History, therefore, was not decided by who was happier or healthier. It was decided by who could produce the most calories to fuel the most bodies. From an evolutionary perspective, the agricultural revolution was a massive success. We made more copies of human DNA than ever before. We successfully spread our genes to every corner of the globe. But evolution does not care about your happiness. It does not care if you are in pain, or if you are enslaved, or if you die at 30 from a tooth infection. It only cares that you survive long enough to reproduce. We fell into what historians call the luxury trap. We adopted farming because we thought it would make life easier. A little more food, a little less danger. But those small luxuries added up to a heavy burden that we could never put down. We domesticated the wheat, but in truth, the wheat domesticated us. So, here is the final verdict. Was the agricultural revolution the smartest thing humans ever did? Or was it the moment we accidentally signed up for a 10,000-year shift in the coal mines? The answer is a massive, ironic paradox. On paper, humanity won. We built pyramids, invented pizza, split the atom, and went to the moon. We conquered the planet. But for the average human, it was a pretty bad deal. We traded a life of camping, hiking, and naps for a life of taxes, flu seasons, and waking up at 6 a.m. to do jobs we hate. We traded the freedom of the open world for the safety of a cage we built ourselves. In fact, look in the mirror. We are still suffering from this transition. Our bodies crave sugar and fat because those things used to be rare treasures. Now they are everywhere, and they are killing us. Our brains are wired to stress about lions hiding in the grass. Now, that same stress mechanism keeps us awake at night, worrying about unread emails. We are essentially hunter-gatherers wearing suits, trying to survive in a concrete zoo. Of course, we can't go back. There are 8 billion of us now. But realizing that our bodies and minds weren't designed for this grind is the first step to fixing it. Now, before I go, I need a little assist from you for the next level. I honestly can't decide which historical mystery to tackle next. So please help me out in the comments. What should the next video be? I would really appreciate your suggestions. If you enjoyed questioning your entire existence with us today, hit that like button. It releases dopamine, which your hunter-gatherer brain will love. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.